Testing, testing. Hello, hello.
Welcome to University of Grace. Tonight's topic is sexism or the role of women in the Bible. Please welcome our speaker, Allison Reinke.
All right, thank you for having me. We are going to jump right in and talk about sexism or women in the Bible and their role. So to do that, I first would like to define what is sexism. Sexism by dictionary definition is prejudice, stereotyping, or discrimination, typically against women on the basis of sex. The origin of the word sexism is actually unclear, but it really came about between the 1960s and the 1980s, and likely it was modeled after the term racism. That was after when the civil rights movement was in full swing and going on. So sexism was kind of modeled. Women started to say, wait a minute, we feel discriminated against for our sex, and so that word became a thing. That's when a lot of phrases like it's a man's world, patriarchal society, and all of those things came to be. Male domination, those were all things that women started recognizing or saying during that time, and that is when the word sexism was pretty much born. In extreme situations, sexism can be categorized as misogyny, which is hatred of women, leading often to brutality in the form of violence, domestic violence, and rape. So we are going to talk about a few of the modern policies for women around the world. I've got my women's suffrage picture up there, but we're going to talk about that. On June 4th, 1919, the United States Congress passed the 19th Amendment, giving women the right to vote, and it was ratified on August 18th, 1920. The women's suffrage movement pushed this right into law, and the 19th Amendment simply says, the right of citizens of the United States to vote shall not be denied or abridged by the United States or by any state on account of sex. In other countries, to this day, sexism still exists on a much bigger scale. In other countries, women have not been treated as equals, and they face a lot of discrimination for their gender. In Somalia, 95% of girls experience genital mutilation. We won't get into that, but girls have no choice in that, and it is something that is just done to them simply because they are female. In Brazil, 10 women lose their lives each day due to domestic violence, and some think the number is higher than that. There is a 70 to 90% illiteracy rate among Afghanistan women because they are not given education opportunities. That's not allowed. Now, to be fair, men don't have the same education opportunities there that they do here or in other countries either, but women particularly do not. 1 in 3 girls in developing countries worldwide are forced into child marriage before the age of 18, and again, forced, they have no choice, they're just married off. Saudi Arabia allows women to vote, but women were not allowed to drive until roughly a year ago in 2019, but it is still complicated, and the vast majority of women in Saudi Arabia still do not have the right to drive. In 32 countries, women must have their husband's permission to receive a passport, and if they're not married, they have to have a father, and if they don't have a living father or a husband, they have to have a male relative give permission for them to receive a passport. In Iran, girls and women can be punished or killed by men who suspect them of dishonoring their family. So, we're about to jump into the Bible and what we find in the Bible in regards to women and their role and God and Jesus and sexism there. But I do want to say quickly that it would be wrong of me not to acknowledge or validate that women still, even in this country, and it's hard to even say that because you look around at what's being done to women in so many other countries, but I don't want to make excuses. I do want to say that it is valid that women feel that way. We do know still in corporate world, a lot of times women and men are not paid the same. We know that there is the phrase in politics or entertainment industry or music, all of those places that someone has to sleep their way to the top, and that would be in reference to women. So a lot of women still feel like there are strides that need to happen, and so I do want to validate that the feelings are real. But what we are going to talk about now is the Bible. So God did call himself the Father, and so he set up a patriarchal, it was a patriarchy, a father in charge, and so God did set that up, and there's nothing wrong with that. But what happens a lot of times is people take the Bible and they try to make sexism exist in the Bible where it didn't, and that's what we're going to get into now. So we're going to talk about the role of women of the Old Testament. In traditional Judaism, Jewishness is passed down through the mother, although the father's name is used to describe sons and daughters in the Torah. So, for example, Dinah, they would say Dinah, daughter of Jacob. So they still use the father to describe that, but they recognize that Jewishness is passed from the mother down. Even Wikipedia, if you know about Wikipedia, people can just put things in there, but even Wikipedia states that I found, according to Jewish tradition, a covenant was formed between the Israelites and the God of Abraham at Mount Sinai. The Torah relates that both Israelite men and Israelite women were present at Mount Sinai when this covenant was made with Abraham. The covenant was worded in such a way that it bound men to act upon its requirements and to ensure that all the members of their household met these requirements as well. And those were women, children, servants, all of those things. So the covenant bound women indirectly, but women were still bound by the covenant that God made at Mount Sinai with Abraham. Women were also, Jewish tradition says, women were required to make a pilgrimage once a year to the temple in Jerusalem and offer the Passover sacrifice. So women had to do those things as well. So now, in the Bible, the treatment and role of women of the Old Testament, and I just told you that Israel women were free, had to participate in some of the things, but they were free to participate in their communities. And a lot of scholars and historians believe that Jewish women actually had a lot more freedom back when we look at the Old Testament than they did by the time that Jesus came along. And so we'll talk more about that. But in the Old Testament, they were allowed to buy and sell. They were allowed to worship in prayer, dance and music, participate in ceremonies. They were simply not allowed to be priest or high priest at that time. So, all right. The Bible uses in the Old Testament men, the word men or man, a lot. But you have to remember that the Bible is translated. And so people will jump on that and say, God only addressed men, or, people in the Old Testament, they only addressed men. They are referring, when they say man or men, to mankind. So you could use a different word there. You could say human. It's not excluding women. It's saying man in reference to mankind, all of us that are made in God's image. So, all right, we are going to talk about the buying and selling part. I told you women were allowed to buy and sell. And Proverbs 31 is long. That's the first thing we're going to talk about. And you can see, I took out up there, if you can see it, just the phrases that deal with buying and selling. But I want to say something. I found some great things about Proverbs 31. Women sometimes groan when we hear Proverbs 31 because it tells about this great woman. And any Bible study that I've been in where they talk about that, the women always feel like, great, I'm not going to measure up to this Proverbs 31 woman. So I love what I found on the history of that. And it said the passage was intended to show young men what to value in a woman. It was not a checklist for women. It wasn't to say, I need to be doing this and this and this. It was telling men what to value in a woman. And it wasn't just a woman that had no ambition or wasn't doing anything. So quickly, I want to tell you this about Proverbs 31. The beginning of Proverbs 31, verses 1 through 9, is actually King Lemuel. Let me give a preface here. I will probably pronounce every name wrong tonight. So you just don't, I should have asked my father or Leo or someone all these pronunciations ahead of time, and I did not. So we're just going to go with whatever I say. Lemuel, something like that. King Lemuel, the beginning is actually sayings that his mother taught him. So verses 1 through 9 are not the Proverbs 31 story that we hear about the woman. They were the queen mother's advice to her son about how to live. And that's a great passage to read. I won't take the time to do it now, but it's telling him how to live. They were things passed down from his mom. Now, Proverbs 31, the part we know, the wife of noble character. Interesting fact about that. It is one of 13 alphabetical in Hebrew acrostic poems. And there's a verse 10 and verse 29 that I'm about to read. There's a word, hayil, in the Hebrew language. think that's how you pronounce it. And it translates in this, they say a virtuous or noble woman. But most scholars believe it means a forceful, mighty, or valiant woman, because the word is most often used exclusively in the Tanakh when referring to warfare. So the word they're actually talking about in this woman, most scholars believe, is that she's valiant or mighty or forceful, this noble woman that they're talking about. And in some Jewish homes, this little passage in Proverbs is considered high praise of a wife from a husband, and they recite it still on Friday nights at the Shabbat dinner. And so it wasn't to shame women like we often think. It was praising what qualities you should look for in this mighty, valiant woman. And so it just says, I put the main points about buying and selling up there, but it says, a wife of noble character who can find. She is worth far more than rubies. Her husband has full confidence in her and lacks nothing of value. She brings him good, not harm, all the days of her life. She selects wool and flax, and she works with eager hands. She is like the merchant ships bringing her food from afar. She gets up while it is still night and provides food for her family and portions for her female servants. So she has her own servants, she's providing, she's doing that. She considers a field and she buys it. Out of her earnings, she plants a vineyard. She sets about her work vigorously. Her arms are strong for her tasks. She sees that her trading is profitable and her lamp does not go out at night. In her hand, she holds the distaff and grasps the spindles with her fingers. She opens her arms to the poor and extends her hands to the needy. When it snows, she has no fear for her household, for all of them are clothed in scarlet. She makes coverings for their beds. She is clothed in fine linen and purple. Her husband is respected at the city gate, where he takes his seat among the elders of the land. She makes linen garments, and she sells them, and supplies the merchants with sashes. She is clothed with strength and dignity. She can laugh at the days to come. She speaks with wisdom, and faithful instruction is on her tongue. She watches over the affairs of her household. She does not eat the bread of idleness. Her children rise and call her blessed. Her husband also, and he praises her. Many women do noble, but remember what I told you, valiant, mighty things, but you surpass them all. Charm is deceptive and beauty is fleeting, but a woman who fears the Lord is to be praised. Honor her for all that her hands have done, and let her works bring her praise to the city gate. So if you heard all that, what they're saying is find a wife that does these things, that works, that buys, that sells. So she's using her own mind and her own wisdom. And so it's praising a woman who does those things. So manual labor in the Old Testament, the women participated in manual labor. Exodus 35:25 says, all the women who were gifted artisans spun yarn with their hands. Ruth, who we're going to talk more about later, in Ruth 2:7, she said, please let me glean and gather after the reapers among the sheaves. So she came and continued from morning until now, though she rested a little in the house. And then Samuel 8:13. This verse, they had come to Samuel grumbling that they needed a king. The people were saying they needed a king. And the context of this verse is that Samuel told them, well, the king will take your sons and make them do this and this and this, and he'll take some of your servants for himself, and he will take your daughters to be perfumers, cooks, bakers. So again, women were not excluded from working. Also, they were not excluded from worship or religious practices. So we often think, I think I kind of sometimes had a picture that the women, they couldn't worship like the men did, but they were included in that. And these are some verses that show that. They participated in worship and celebrations and all of those things. In Psalm, it says the singers went before, the players on instruments followed after. Among them were the damsels. It does call them damsels in most translations, with timbrels or tambourines. 1 Samuel, this is about Hannah. We're going to talk about Hannah later. 1 Samuel 1:12, it says, it came to pass as she, Hannah, continued praying before the Lord, that Eli marked her mouth. What the significance of that is, marked her mouth means he was reading her lips. she was praying in the temple. Eli was a priest. Hannah was there praying and praying and praying to God, and the priest was watching her, so she was free to go and pray. 2 Samuel 6:19 says, all of this part, little backstory on this. This verse is David was dancing in the street, celebrating a victory, and actually what we don't talk about, his wife Michal, she's not happy about it, and she gets on to him. But this verse just talks about how even the king, he included the women. It says, he dealt among all the people, even among the whole multitude of Israel, as well to the women as men, to everyone a cake of bread. I don't know what a cake of bread is, but that sounds great. A cake of bread, a good piece of flesh, and a flagon of wine, whatever that is. So all the people departed, everyone to his house. So the women were included in what the king was passing out. Song of Solomon, the only reason I included these two verses, Song of Solomon is all the love stuff, and it's told from both the woman's point of view and men. But in both of the verses in Solomon, they call them daughters of Zion. So we often hear sons of God or but they were called daughters even in the Old Testament as well. All right. I've lost clicking power. Next slide, included. The women were included. So when God instituted covenants, as I told you before, they were included. They were present when the Torah was read to Israel by Joshua. Women were to be present when the scriptures were read at the Feast of Tabernacles. And so those two verses just deal with that. Your little ones, your wives, sojourner who's in your camp. Basically, everyone comes for those things, the women included. So they were included in scripture reading and those things as well. Women in leadership. Now we're going to talk about that and how we saw examples of women in leadership in the Old Testament. They served in leadership roles in Israel, which may surprise you, but Miriam, Moses' sister, for example, led the women in worship. And the verse that I have reference to is Exodus 15:20 and 21, and this is after the Israelites have been freed from slavery in Egypt, and the Red Sea has swallowed the Egyptian army up, and Miriam, who it refers to as a prophetess and the sister of Aaron, Moses as well, she took a tambourine in her hand, and all the women went out after her with tambourines and dancing, and Miriam sang to them, "Sing to the Lord, for he has triumphed gloriously. The horse and the rider he has thrown into the sea." The verse in Judges that I referenced was about Deborah, and we are going to talk about her later. But Deborah was a prophetess and a judge. She was judging Israel at the time. I like that verse included the wife of Lapidoth. She was a judge, and she was judging Israel, and she was a prophetess. She was also married, but she was doing all these things in her own right by God's appointment. And the last verse I have up there is about Huldah, the prophetess, and we're not going to talk about her later, so I'll tell you just a little bit about that. 2 Kings 22:14 through 20 is the verses that I'm going to read, but Josiah was king when he was 8 years old. And when Josiah got older, he sent some of his men to a priest named Hilkiah, something like that. And the priest told these men that he had found the book of law. Well, they brought the book of law back to Josiah, and Josiah realized, we have been not doing anything that God wanted of us. The people are living in complete sin. They're not worshiping the one true God. And so Josiah tore his clothes. He was very upset. And he sent these men to see the prophetess Huldah. And so this is where I pick up with the verse I referenced up there. So Hilkiah the priest and Ahikam and Akbar and Shaphan and Asaiah went to Huldah the prophetess, keeper of the wardrobe, and they talked with her. And she said to them, "Thus says the Lord." What does that tell us? She, a woman, heard from the Lord. He spoke to her and told her what to tell these men that the king had sent. So, thus says the Lord, the God of Israel, tell the man who sent you to me, thus says the Lord, I will bring disaster upon this place and upon its inhabitants. She tells him all the bad things that's going to happen in that verse. But then she does say, because God saw King Josiah tear his robes and mourn over the sinfulness of his people, God said he would let Josiah go in peace to his ancestors and not see God's wrath. So basically, God's wrath won't happen until Josiah has gone peacefully and he has passed away, because Josiah was so upset over the behavior. But the significance of those verses that I wanted to show you is that women were used by God in leadership. The Lord spoke to women. We know he spoke to men. We always hear about that. But God spoke directly to women and gave them messages to give men and kings. And so that was the significance there. This next part, God used wives and wise women to lead. So Proverbs says intelligent wives are a gift from God. Genesis 21 and 12, I like this. We always hear about Sarah just laughing about God telling her, and I'm going to talk more about Sarah, but we hear about Sarah and we think she's just this old woman who laughed when they said that she was going to have a baby in her old age. But this verse, Genesis 21 and 12 says, but God said to Abraham, be not displeased because of the boy. It's talking about Ishmael, the son that he had with the slave girl. He says, be not displeased because of the boy and because of your slave woman. Whatever Sarah says to you, do as she tells you. So God told Abraham, and we know that God established man as the head of the household, but he still used wives and women to minister to men. And he said, do as Sarah tells you. For through Isaac, Sarah's son, shall your offspring be named. So God directly tells Abraham, do as Sarah tells you. Proverbs 18 and 22, like I said, it says that he who finds a wife finds a good thing and obtains favor from the Lord. And then the other verse in Proverbs says, house and wealth are inherited from fathers, but a prudent wife is from the Lord. And prudent means intelligent wife is from the Lord. Abigail, and I don't talk about her later, and this is kind of a longer story, and you should take time to read it. I'm not going to read all of that to you. But Abigail, who we know as David's wife, and she does marry David. She was originally married to a man named Nabal, and David and him had a problem. And without getting into all that, there was a political problem between the two of them. And so the verse I included says, when Abigail saw David, she hurried and got down from the donkey and fell before David on her face and bowed to the ground. She fell at his feet and said, on me alone, my Lord, be the guilt. Please let your servant speak in your ears and hear the words of your servant. And David said to Abigail, blessed be the Lord, the God of Israel, who sent you to me this day, to meet me this day. So Abigail negotiated a political problem between her husband and David. And when her husband later died, David brought Abigail in and married her because the Bible tells us he was impressed with her wisdom. And so Abigail, we know she was beautiful, but she was wise and she was brave, and she negotiated between the king and her husband, which took bravery, and David acknowledged that God sent her. The last verse I included on this was about a wise woman in Tekoa, and that's a longer story too that you might want to read. But Joab sent to Tekoa to bring a wise woman from there. Joab had told her to pretend to mourn. That's the gist of this story. At Joab's instructions, she was supposed to make up a story about mourning someone and tell it to King David. And when King David told her the just and right thing to do about the story she made up that she was telling him, she was able to turn that back and say, you need to do the same thing for your son Absalom that you have banished. And so her wisdom led David to unbanish Absalom and feel compassion for him. And that was her wisdom and her listening to Joab. So those were all examples of just times that women were used by God. And now we are going to talk about notable women of the Old Testament. And I have pictures. These are not real pictures, obviously. And some of these women I ended up finding later for other women in the Bible. So, but these are just representative, and I'm going to talk about these women to you. So I have to think about where you see it here on your screen at home. Top right, the lady with the wheat, Ruth. She's representing Ruth for us. So I'm going to talk about Ruth. And all of these notable women of the Old Testament, my goal is just for you to see, without having to spell it out in other ways, that this spells out a picture of God using women in mighty ways in his story in the Old Testament. So Ruth, she was significant because Jesus would be in the bloodline that came from Ruth. So a little background on Ruth. Ruth and Orpah, not Oprah, Orpah. Ruth and, I wrote Oprah twice in my notes and I had to rewrite it. Ruth and Orpah were, were married to Naomi's 2 sons. Naomi had 2 sons. All 3 of those women's husbands died. So Naomi lost her husband and she lost both of her sons. So Ruth, Orpah, and Naomi were widows. Naomi was going to return to her homeland of Bethlehem, and she tells her 2 daughter-in-laws, you need to go back to your families. She's permitting them. Go back to your families. They'll take you in. Go. Orpah does. And it's not that she does anything wrong. She does what Naomi tells her. She goes back to her family. Ruth refuses. Ruth says, I'm going to go with you, and that's where we pick up now. So Ruth was loyal to her mother-in-law, and she went back with her to her homeland of Bethlehem. Their story is long, and I'm not going to get into all of that, so I'll just tell you, again, it's one I recommend that you read if you don't know the story of Ruth, because it's a beautiful story. But Ruth and Naomi went to work in the field of Boaz, and I read the verse about Ruth. She would go and pick up. Between the people that were picking wheat behind them, she would go and gather for her and Naomi. And she would go and lay at the foot of Boaz's bed. She was trying to be a very present person in his life. She knew that if Boaz would take her in, she and Naomi would be taken care of. And so she met him, and she does get her wish. That's the longer part of the story you should read. And she and Boaz are married, and they would become great-grandparents to King David. So Ruth taking this bold step, leaving her homeland and family, going with her mother-in-law, and then being willing to work in Boaz's field and be ever present, knowing that this was what they needed to take care of her and Naomi. Her boldness led to greatness, and Ruth was devoted to the Lord. We know that. And the picture of Boaz and Ruth, most people, there's beautiful stories about this that you can read as well, but the picture of Boaz and Ruth show us a beautiful picture of redemption and love, and is a picture that points to God's redemption and love for us. So it's worth reading the whole thing, but I love this verse, and this is one we often quote, Ruth 1:16. But Ruth replied, this is to Naomi, don't urge me to leave you or turn back from you. Where you go, I will go. Where you stay, I will stay. Your people will be my people, and your God, my God. So Ruth was a woman that was devoted to her mother-in-law and went. Next, we're going to talk about Rachel, and she's the picture with the man in this image, if you need a picture of her. That's Jacob. Rachel was loved by Jacob, and Jacob worked 7 years. If you don't know the story, he met Rachel at a well, and she got water for his camels, and he wanted to marry Rachel. He was smitten with her. He was in love with Rachel. So he went to her dad, and he asked for her hand, and Laban, her dad, said, smart man, many might think. He said, if you'll work for me for 7 years, you can marry my daughter. So Laban did. He worked for 7 years. The wedding came. They would have been veiled at the wedding. He was tricked. He married her older sister, who had to be married first, Leah. So, poor Leah, because we don't really know much about her except she wasn't very loved. I mean, we know she has a lot of sons and all of these things, but Leah was not the choice bride. He marries Leah. He still wants to marry Rachel. He's in love with Rachel, so he works another 7 years to marry Rachel. So 14 years he's waited on this girl and done what needed to be done, and Rachel waited on him as well. And so they get married, happy. Leah's having all these sons and children. She's having just boy after boy. Rachel cannot have any children. And here Rachel is his love, and she wants to give him a child, and she can't. So she finally, like Sarah and so many other women, she gives him her maidservant, and she has 2 sons, but Rachel is still unable to have sons. And she prays and she asks God and she trusts God, and eventually God blesses her with Joseph. And Joseph, with God's help, saved Israel. At his time, Joseph saved Israel. And so, with the help of God, of course. And then the next son she has is Benjamin, and Benjamin is the last tribe of Israel. So both of her sons were very significant, and she had waited and been patient. Her strength and patience and faith play a role in the history of God's redemption for his people. And I love the verse, Genesis 30:22, and God remembered Rachel, and God hearkened to her and opened her womb. So right there, God, he remembered Rachel. Love that part of the story. Hannah is the woman praying with the white on her head. Hannah begged God for a son. I told you that earlier, Eli would see her praying and read her lips. Hannah would go and she would beg God for a son. She tirelessly prayed for a son. So she made a promise with God. She said, if you will give me a son, I will give him back to you. I will turn my son, when he's old enough, I will turn my son over to you, and I will give him to you, God, for your service. So she did what she said. God blessed her with a son, and when Samuel was old enough, she brought him to the temple, to the priest Eli, fulfilling her promise to God. And Eli took in Samuel and taught him all the ways of God. So we always hear the story in Sunday school of Samuel hearing God's voice from a young age, and the story of waking Eli up and thinking Eli's calling him, but it's Samuel. But Hannah's willingness to do what God wanted and God's favor on Hannah in giving her a son led to Samuel being there. And Samuel helped free the Israelites from slavery in Canaan, and Samuel is the one who anointed King David. Hannah's sacrifice and promise served God in a mighty way. And the verse 1 Samuel 1:11 says, and she vowed a vow and said, O Lord of hosts, if you will indeed look on the affliction of your servant and remember me and not forget your servant, but will give to your servant a son, then I will give him to the Lord all the days of his life, and no razor shall touch his head. And so God gave Hannah what she had asked him for. Now we're going to talk about Deborah, and I love the picture of Deborah because there's actually 2 women in Deborah's story. Deborah is the one with the sword and the black down there. Deborah, there's 2 women, and Jael is the other one we're going to talk about. I will talk about them quickly, but I encourage you to read the longer version of their stories. Deborah was a female judge of Israel appointed by God. That's what the Bible tells us, and she's a judge. She was passionate and determined to return worship from pagan and idol worship to the one true God. She got rid of evildoers that had kept Israel in slavery and bondage, and her story, part of her story that is cool, she prophesied a battle that would be led by Barak, in which Sisera and his army would be defeated. So Barak didn't want to go face, he was scared. He didn't want to go face Sisera and his army alone. He wanted a prophet to go with him. And so Sisera, the leader of Jabin's army, was scary to Barak, and Deborah recognized this, and she says, fine, I will go. She, Deborah, the prophetess, she will go with him since he won't go face the enemy without a prophet. But she said, because of this, God will give the victory to a woman. So I'm going to make my own translation, but she said, Barak, because you are not man enough to face the enemy alone, I will let a woman be man enough to win, to be victorious. So that's my words. That's my translation. The Bible doesn't say that. But the Bible says a woman will get the victory. Punishment to Barak. You're not going to get Sisera, a woman will. So just as Deborah prophesied, Barak led the battle, and they defeated Sisera's army, and Sisera got away. So here's where we pick up with a woman named Jael. Jael was married to a man named Heber, and their campsite was close to the battlefields, and they made metal and tent stakes and all these metal things, so they were close to the battlefield. All of Sisera's men had been killed by Barak and the army, and he alone survived and was running for his life. He came upon their tents, and we know that Jael and her husband had separate tents. So she had her own space, he had his, they were in the campsite together, but she had her own tent. He came up on Jael's tent, and he asked her to hide him, and she welcomed him in, and she covered him with a rug. She gave him warm goat's milk to drink, and he fell fast asleep. We don't tell this in Sunday school because it's not always a great Sunday school story. In fact, this murder is one of the most gruesome that the Old Testament tells us about. But Jael, using her head and being smart, and knowing that she had tent stakes readily available, when she lured him to sleep with the warm milk and the rug, she took a tent stake and she drove it through his temple, and she killed Sisera. God gave the victory over Sisera to a woman. So Deborah and Jael were pretty mighty women that God gave the victory to. Judges 4:9 says, Deborah says, "Certainly I will go with you," said Deborah, "but because of the course you are taking, the honor will not be yours, for the Lord will deliver Sisera into the hands of a woman." And he did. So Jael and Deborah played a mighty role in that. Esther, she's the queen. She's got the crown on in the picture. Esther was chosen. Her story is beautiful too and long, and I can't tell you the whole thing, so I encourage you to read it. But Esther was chosen by King, I never say it, I think it's Xerxes. We're just going to call him Xerxes. King X. She was chosen by King X to be a part of his harem, and then he was so taken with her that she became the queen. She was able to use her position as queen to convince the king to get rid of a man named Haman. Haman wanted the Jews gone, dead, persecuted, driven out, gone. No more Jews. Mordecai was Esther's relative, and he came to her and he said, "You have to do something." And so Esther was courageous. She listened to Mordecai, and she took a leap of faith. You were not allowed, even the queen, to go into the king's chambers without being invited in. And so she knew in doing so she could die. But she went before the king, and he saw her, had compassion, let her come in, and she told him of the plan that Haman and his men had and what they were going to do to the Jews, who were her people. And the king got rid of Haman, and the Jews were saved. So bravery on her part saved many of God's people. And Esther was willing to die for her people. I love the verse, Esther 4:16. That's where it starts. It says, "Go," she tells Mordecai, "go gather together all the Jews that are present in Shushan and fast and neither eat nor drink for 3 days, night or day. I and my maidens will do the same," she tells him. "And so will I go in unto the king, which is not according to the law. And if I perish, I perish." And I love that she was willing to perish to save God's people, the Jews. And so he used Esther and her beauty in a mighty way to save his people. Miriam, she's got the tambourine. Miriam was Moses' older sister and a prophetess. The Bible tells us she was a prophetess in her own right. But Miriam, we know, saved Moses with God's help and her quick thinking. She put Moses in a basket. They were going to kill the Jewish babies, and she put Moses in a basket, hid him in the bulrushes. She hid and watched, and Pharaoh's daughter found Moses in the basket. Miriam was able to go to Pharaoh's daughter and say, "I know a nurse that can take care of this baby," a Jewish nurse. It was their own mother. So she got her mother to be able to take care of Moses. And Miriam helped Moses have a devotion to God. She was able to be a part of his life because of her thinking. He went on to, we know what Moses did. He went on to lead Israel out of bondage towards the promised land. And I already read you the verse that I had about Miriam with the timbrel in her hand. There's a lot more about Miriam as well, but she had a hand in getting those Egyptians out from the very beginning when she saved Moses, and her quick thinking did. Oh, I did mean to ask about the pronunciation of this second to last woman of the Old Testament I'm going to tell you about. I think it's Jehosheba, maybe Jehosheba, if you're looking for the spelling, but I have it in your papers. Jehosheba was King Joram's daughter. She is like a sad fairy tale story. And up there, she's the woman with the baby at the top, the younger woman in the top with the baby. She is an awesome aunt, which I consider myself to be, so I think I relate to her story. But she had an evil stepmother. She was a princess, Sounds like a fairy tale. The evil stepmother, the king had died. She wanted a power grab. She wanted the kingdom, so she wanted to get rid of anybody that could have anything to do with the line. And so she was going to kill the babies. She was going to, there's so much killing of babies, but she was going to kill this baby who was in line for the throne. And so Joash. And so Jehoshaphat knew, she heard of the plan, and she used quick thinking. And the verse, 2 Kings 1:1-2 says, Jehoshaphat, the daughter of King Jehoram, sister of Ahaziah, took Joash, son of Ahaziah, and stole him away from among the royal princes who were about to be murdered. She put him and his nurse in a bedroom to hide him from Athaliah, so he was not killed. So her quick thinking saved Joash. More importantly, if Joash had died, King David's royal bloodline would have stopped. And we knew that Jesus was supposed to come through that bloodline. It was significant. And so Joash's death would have meant the end of that royal bloodline. And her quick thinking saved him. And she took him to the temple. She knew the pagans wouldn't come there, and she was able to protect him. So lastly, the old woman at the bottom with the baby, that's supposed to be Sarah. Sarah was Abraham's wife. I already told you about her, but she gave birth to Isaac, who Abraham's sons that he was promised would come through Isaac. That all of the promise of God would come through Isaac. And Sarah laughed when she found out she was going to have a child. They believe she was 90 when she had him. Now, they did live longer then, but 90 is pretty old. So, sorry if you are 90, but it's pretty old to have a baby. It is pretty old to be carrying a baby. And so she did laugh, but God gave her Isaac, who would carry on Abraham's people and the promise of God. Genesis 17:19 says, God said, Sarah thy wife shall bear thee a son indeed, and thou shalt call his name Isaac, and I will establish my covenant with him for an everlasting covenant with his seed after him. So that is the only women of the Old Testament that I'm going to tell you about, but there are so many, and I encourage you to look up and study more notable women of the Old Testament. Notable women of the New Testament now, and I only have 4 of them that I'm going to talk about. The top one, peeking out from behind the stone, we're going to say that's Mary Magdalene. Mary Magdalene followed Jesus faithfully, and there is a lot, people try to create a lot of things about Mary Magdalene and Jesus' relationship, but Mary Magdalene was quite simply a woman who had been healed, the Bible says, of demons, demonic spirits. She had been healed by Jesus, and she faithfully followed his ministry. He had healed other women that were with her as well. She was there for most of his ministry. She was at his death on the cross. She was at his burial. She was the first to find the empty tomb, and we'll talk a little bit more about that in conclusion in a moment. She witnessed the resurrection. That's what we'll talk about. He had healed her. She was devoted to him. She's connected with Joanna and Susanna, who were 2 other women that Jesus had healed. We don't hear about them as much, but they were kind of a group of women that went together and were a part of Jesus' ministry. They helped take care of the disciples and people where Jesus went. And all of them had been healed by Jesus. While the 12 disciples were men, Mary and these other women did follow them, and they were very much a part of their ministry. Mary Magdalene, John 20:18 says, Mary Magdalene went and announced to the disciples, this is after the resurrection, I have seen the Lord, and that he had said these things to her. We're going to talk more about that in conclusion. But Priscilla, I have her as the woman in the bottom in purple. Priscilla and her husband, Aquila, were leaders in Acts. No, I think I had Priscilla as the woman in the blue. Don't worry about it, but Priscilla is one of those women. You can pick. Priscilla and her husband Aquila were leaders in Acts. Many considered Priscilla, who we often don't hear about, but many considered Priscilla to be the first female preacher of the early church. Paul preached in their home, and he worked part-time for Priscilla and her husband Aquila in a tent-making shop. Priscilla shared the duties in that shop with her husband. They are a good example of a husband and wife ministry team. They serve as a great example of that. And they spread the gospel of Christ. This is after Christ. They spread the gospel of Christ with Paul. They mentored young people, they helped the poor, and they led many to Christ. Paul said in Romans 16, 3 and 4, "Greet Priscilla and Aquila, my co-workers in Christ Jesus." He includes her, the woman, as his co-worker in Christ Jesus. "They risked their lives for me. Not only I, but all the churches of the Gentiles are grateful to them." So Priscilla was a mighty part in the first church. Lydia is the one I have in purple at the bottom, because Lydia was a businesswoman. She was from Thyatira in Turkey. There was a group of craftsmen that knew how to produce and sell this expensive purple dye. Purple was very expensive then, and they knew how to make it and sell it. She was a woman included in this group of craftsmen. She was independently wealthy because of this, the Bible tells us. And she, unlike those around her who were pagan worshipers at the time, she worshiped the one true God. She was a God-fearer, the Bible tells us, and she prayed with other women. Paul and Silas met her in Greece, and they introduced her to Jesus. She shared her Christian faith with many others, and a lot of people came to be baptized because of Lydia. She became an important part of the church that was established in Greece. And Acts 16 and 14 says, "One who heard us was a woman named Lydia from the city of Thyatira, a seller of purple goods who was a worshiper of God. The Lord opened her heart to pay attention to what was said by Paul." And so the Lord opened her heart, and he used her in ministry in Greece. Phoebe, she's one of them. Phoebe met Paul in Corinth. So all of these women are part of the new church after Christ with Paul. Phoebe met Paul in Corinth. She traveled for business, and Paul used her. So she was a woman, way back then, traveling for business. So Paul used her to carry letters to the Christians in Rome. He spoke of her in a letter, and he referred to her as a deacon. So in my research, I found Paul only referred to 5 people as deacons, including himself and Timothy. She's the only woman that Paul called a deacon, and a deacon would be a minister, and Paul called her that. He also uses the word benefactor, but the Greek word is prostatis, which means a woman set above others. So benefactor there means a woman set above others. She was a leader, and she used her wealth to help the Christian ministry. And Romans 16 and 2 says that you may welcome her in the Lord in a way worthy of the saints, and help her in whatever she may need from you, for she has been a patron of many, and myself as well. All right, now we're going to talk about Jesus and women, and we'll go quick. First miracle. So the very first miracle is Jesus turning water into wine. And who asked him to do that? His mother. They're at a wedding and a celebration. Jesus had just been baptized, but was not ready to start his ministry yet. He says it's not his time. His time is not at hand when she asked him. I want to say something significant about the story. I don't read the whole story of any of these. I have the verse references in your paper, but it's John 2, 1 through 12. But Jesus addresses her as woman, and he addresses her as woman again at the cross. And we can think that is something derogatory, like he's calling his mom woman, because we often say woman like woman stop, woman no, woman. It's not used kindly most of the time. He calls her woman here, and according to Vine's expository dictionary of Old and New Testament words, woman was not a harsh addressing or a corrective term. It was a word of respect and endearment. Jesus calls many women woman when he addresses them. It wasn't a putting her down. It was a term of endearment. It was polite, and that was a way that he addressed many women. So Jesus' mother asked him to do this miracle. He's not ready to kick off his ministry yet, but because of compassion for his mother, he does his first miracle. And he does his first miracle because a woman, his mom, asked him to. Healing. Jesus healed lots of women. I'm going to talk about this one. There was a woman with an issue of blood she'd had for 12 years. Not only was that horrible for her, it made her considered unclean. So the woman was seen as unclean. She saw Jesus and she knew he could heal her. So she pushed through the crowd and she grabs the back of his garment. And that is socially unacceptable. Because remember what I told you, in the Old Testament, women actually had more rights and freedoms than they did by the time Jesus came along. By the time Jesus came along, he shouldn't have addressed women in public. He broke the social norm. You didn't address women that were not your wife in public, and even if your wife was with you, the men did not address other women directly, and Jesus did. She broke social norms to grab his garment. He breaks social norms in what he does. He felt power leave him. He turned and asked who touched him. She threw herself at his feet and confessed. And he handled her with complete compassion. He looked at her and said, daughter. He referred to a lot of women as woman and a lot of women as daughter. Daughter of God, daughter. Daughter, your faith has healed you. Go in peace. And so that's a beautiful story in Mark 5. But that's just one example of a woman that he healed. Another way Jesus dealt with women was patience and defense. Martha and Mary were Jesus' friends. Jesus and his followers were visiting their home in Bethany, and we always hear this story that Martha was working in the kitchen and she fusses at Jesus, which she was comfortable doing. That tells you how Jesus dealt with women, because she was comfortable fussing to Jesus, but she was fussing to Jesus because Mary wasn't helping her, and Mary was sitting at Jesus' feet. The more significance there, women weren't allowed to do that. They weren't allowed to sit at the feet of Jesus with the men. The men were in there listening to him, and she's sitting in there at his feet, and she should have been helping Martha with what the women did at that time. So she fusses, and Jesus is not mean to her. He handles her gently, and he says, Martha, Martha, you are worried and upset about many things, but only one thing is needed. So he has patience with Martha in dealing with her. And he says, Mary has chosen what is better, and it will not be taken away from her. So he defends Mary for breaking the social norm to sit at his feet, because that was far more important than working in the kitchen. So he has patience with one and defends the other. And Jesus let her know, without belittling Martha, that was the better thing to do. That story's in Luke 10, 38 through 42. Jesus showed compassion to women many times. One particular time is with Mary and Martha again. Their brother Lazarus had died. They had called for Jesus to come because they knew that Jesus could heal him and he had been sick. Jesus delays coming. The Bible tells us he made a choice and delayed coming. When he gets there, Martha runs out and Martha fusses at him again. So once again, we know that she was comfortable to fuss at Jesus, but she fusses at Jesus, and she tells him, if you had come sooner, and she's so upset. If you had come sooner, he would have been healed. And she asked him, Lord, where have you been? Where were you? And so Jesus goes with her, and when Mary sees him, she asks him the same thing, why didn't you come? Love the compassion shown here. Jesus weeps one time in the Bible, and this is it. Jesus looks at Mary and her friends who are weeping over Lazarus, and Jesus knows what he's about to do. He's going to bring Lazarus to life. But even so, he's so moved by compassion for Mary and the other women and the people gathered that are mourning that we get our shortest verse in the Bible, Jesus wept. Why? Because of the compassion that he felt for those women. He knew what he was going to do, but his compassion for them made him weep. And that story is John 11, 1 through 44. All of these are great stories to read the whole thing. Acceptance. Jesus accepted women. When he was visiting the home of Simon the Pharisee, he was eating with men, and a woman entered into the room. She fell down at Jesus' feet. She was a known sinner in town. Doesn't detail exactly what her sin is, but people believe she was a prostitute. She fell at his feet, and she began to cry. Well, we always hear she wiped his feet with her tears, but you have to understand that when she cried on his feet, he wore sandals. It would have made mud. She sees that her tears have made, she takes her hair and she cleans his feet, and the men in the room are mortified. This is not okay and not acceptable in any way. But Jesus allowed her to show her love in that way, and he accepted her gift. He broke the social norm and accepted the gift from the woman again. Luke 36 is where that story begins. Equality and justice. A woman was caught in the act of adultery and brought before Jesus. The Pharisees were testing Jesus. This was a test. They brought her caught in the act, and they were testing him to see what he would do. And Jesus silently bent down and he wrote in the sand. And the Bible doesn't tell us what he wrote, but he just bent down and started writing in the sand. When he stood, he looks at the group of men that brought her and the accusers, and he says, "Let the one among you who is without sin cast the first stone." And then he bent down and wrote in the sand again. He was not condoning her sin. He was telling the group of accusers instead, look at your own self, reflect on your own sin. Are you without sin? Then you can accuse this woman. If you're not without sin, you can't accuse her. And when Jesus rose again, the men had left. One by one, they had trickled off. And he said, "Woman," so he addresses her directly, "Woman, where are they? Did no one condemn you?" And she replies that no one did. So Jesus tells her he doesn't either. He just says, "Go and sin no more." He doesn't tell her, "You're okay." He says, "Don't sin anymore," but he doesn't accuse her. He would not let her be punished by male accusers that were guilty of their own sin. He was equal in his justice towards her. That starts at John 7:53. And the woman at the well, forgiveness, we know this story well, most of us, but she was a Samaritan. She was considered unclean and unworthy. Jesus sent his disciples on, and he stopped to talk to her at the well, and that was definitely frowned upon. She was a woman and a Samaritan, but Jesus didn't care. He talked openly to her, and the disciples, when they came and saw, they were shocked and mortified because he shouldn't have been talking to a woman, and much less a Samaritan woman, because married men didn't speak to women. Married or single men did not speak to other women. And Jesus knew she had 5 former husbands. He knew she was currently living in sin, but he asked her for a drink without hesitation, and he offered her the living water of salvation in return, and many came to know Jesus that day, and that's John 4. And then the last thing I want to say on how Jesus dealt with women is value. Jesus valued women. You cannot deny that. He appeared first to a woman after he rose, Mary Magdalene. He gave women the privilege of sharing the good news first. He knew, here's a little fact, the women couldn't testify in court, and the disciples would be unlikely to tell others what the women had said because women weren't very believable in his day, and they couldn't be talking in court, and that's who Jesus chose to appear to first. He put value on the women and appeared to them. Jesus chose the women first and sent the women to give the good news to the disciples. That's in John 20. So, last thing, I have a bunch of verses listed, and I will not read them, but there are actually Mark, Luke, and Matthew. Remember, they repeat some of the stories, so some of the verses are repeating same stories. But I know if you're at home, you probably can't see that, but we have flyers at church, or you can try to take a picture because I don't have time to read all of those. I did print them, but I don't have time to read them. But Jesus addressed women directly 20 times. I think I have 19 verses up there, but one of the other times is the woman at the well, the story I just told you. So we have 20 examples of Jesus speaking directly to women. All right, final thoughts. I said on the screen, sexism didn't exist where Jesus is concerned. It just didn't. Jesus was not, there's nothing about his ministry that was sexist. He broke social norms. He broke bondage and disease. He broke barriers. He loved, healed, comforted, sympathized, forgave. He respected and valued women. From a commandment honoring mothers equally, one of the 10 commandments is honor your father and your mother. He gave equal honor to them. God did. To a reluctant first miracle that Jesus did for his mother, to calling women daughters of God. God's word is full of love for women, and we are joint heirs with men as sons and daughters of the Almighty God. Last thoughts that aren't up there. God placed value on women from the beginning. He gave Eve to Adam because of his loneliness and to be a helper. Women were given special roles and distinctions throughout the Bible. I only gave you a few examples. Claims of biblical sexism stem from things like the following verse in Timothy 2:12. Timothy said, "But I suffer not a woman to teach, nor to usurp," or Paul said, to Timothy in a letter. "But I suffer not a woman to teach, nor to usurp authority over the man, but to be in silence." Well, the meaning behind this is often debated and scrutinized, but in final words I just want to say, the translation of the word authority is unusual compared to other references by this author. So there's a lot of debate that that's even what was being said. And also, Paul was writing to Timothy about a specific church. There were already women leaders in other churches working with Paul, as we heard, women that he called deacons and ministers. So this was in reference to a particular church. There is no argument that Jesus was, as our pastor and countless other leaders have referred to him, Jesus was the great equalizer. He was undoubtedly not sexist, and he gave women value and worth and felt their pain, wept for them, and loved them. Jesus was and is today our greatest example of how to treat others, including women. That's it.